Regular John and Redeem asked me something technical or discuss a topic of your choice. It's a little confused here, but they redeem one of the two, and the text, the block of text is, I know Alzheimer's and schizophrenia are different, but could there be any correlation between the two? I know Alzheimer's is the leading cause of dementia, but schizophrenia is also a mental illness, so wondering if both are connected or could be connected.
So
Go ahead.
we know there's some kind of relationship. When schizophrenia was originally discovered by Emil Kraepelin, or not discovered, but sort of named and theorized about by Emil Kraepelin, he called it dementia praecox, meaning like it was sort of like a precocious or early dementia, because there was these known similarities between people with schizophrenia and people with dementia. And then that idea was discredited as we learned more about schizophrenia, and saw how it is, and about dementia, and saw how they are different in certain ways. But more recently, we have realized that there are several genetic disorders where your risk of schizophrenia and your risk of dementia are both quite elevated. So an example would be what's called 22q deletion syndrome, or sometimes velocardiofacial syndrome, which is the most common genetic disorder in people. And it raises your risk for both schizophrenia early on in your life and for Alzheimer's later. So we know because of that they're related in some way. And very recent research has just done this huge data mining sample and found that there's actually a lot of like that old idea them being related is actually probably correct, and it was discredited too early, and that there is some sort of link between dementia and schizophrenia, but we're not sure exactly what it is. There's definitely genes and inflammation and things like that involved. We also know that people with schizophrenia, their brain ages prematurely. So whether they get dementia or not, they look on brain scans like they are generally about 10 to 20 years. Their brains look 10 to 20 years older than the person actually is. So we know there's some sort of relationship between schizophrenia and brain aging, and between schizophrenia and dementia, but we're fairly new at figuring out what this all means. Or very late to what had already been figured out. I don't know.
You talked about like how there could be like genes, for example, like a genetic issue, I guess the way to phrase it is, that leads to both. But couldn't that just be because of like a common pathway type thing? Like if you get, like hit in the head really hard, then your brain can get damaged in various ways. And then, but you wouldn't say that like all of the different brain damages that you can get from getting hit in the head really hard are linked, beyond the fact that they're all in the brain, right? So could it be something like, or how do we know it's not simply, these genes are important for brain formation, and if you screw that up, then like all, any mental thing can go wrong in your brain. Not that there's a special link between these two specific mental illnesses.
Sure. So we know that there are some general risk factors, and they tend to contribute to sort of more general disorders. So for example, almost every genetic syndrome raises your risk for ADHD, raises your risk for intellectual delay. Like it's just generally your brain is functioning in a different way. But
is it intellectual delay? Is that the new term
for mental retardation?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's exactly correct.
For listeners who are not aware, maybe, so there's like this history in psychology of where there's like a scientific term for this concept, and then it gets used by like the general populace to become like an offensive insult, like retardation being an example. Idiot, I think, was also an example.
Imbecile was invented to reduce stigma.
the psychologists have to keep inventing new terms so as
We
to not be
do.
offensive, right? And so I just
Right.
wanted to check.
Yes.
Mental delay. It was it called?
Intellectual delay.
Intellectual delay. Okay.
Yep. But those are general, like they seem to involve a number of different brain pathways or just sort of wholesale brain differences. Like there's just a lot of, ways that you can develop ADHD. It could be chemical or structural or electric, or all the different ways that the brain works, and it could be along any number of pathways. So it could be frontal, or it could be sort of more midbrain. Like they're just sort of general risk factors. But schizophrenia and Alzheimer's both are caused by much more specific things that go wrong in the brain. So that's just they're not. They are not, your risk for them is not raised by those general factors like a head injury or inflammation or things like that. At least not to the extent that they're raised in velocardiofacial syndrome or things like that. So people with velocardiofacial syndrome are at like 22 times the risk of schizophrenia, I think. And a very high rate of Alzheimer's later. I don't know what the risk is, but so we know that like
Before you
it's
move on,
not
sorry.
just.
I
What'd
just
you say?
wanna- Before you move on from what you just said, I want to give some context for people who might like the number might sound a little misleading, because like the base rate presumably is a little bit low.
Is
right?
really low,
Like if you
right.
have like a 1 in a million
Right.
chance, then 22 times higher is 22 in a million chance, which is still pretty low.
Right.
So yeah, I
Right.
just wanted to give that context before we move on. Go ahead.
Right. So schizophrenia proper is about 0.7% of the population. So certainly most people with velocardiofacial syndrome do not develop schizophrenia, but a much higher percentage of them do than people in the general population. So it's a much higher risk. But even then, still you have more people with velocardiofacial syndrome who don't have schizophrenia than not. But because they're caused by, sort of much more specific brain pathways, you're just not at risk for schizophrenia just because you got hit in the head or something like that. That doesn't raise your risk really. Even the really high risk factors like being born after your mother had an infection during the second trimester only raises your risk like threefold.
The point being
We
that
know
22 is a
that-
lot bigger than 3.
22 is a lot, and some of the biomarkers that you see like in Alzheimer's, like those plaques that we can see, these tangles in the brain, are just not general. So we know that there's an actual genetic link as opposed to just a general risk factor.
Okay, and then regular John adds at the end, possible or chance of getting both Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. I can't imagine having both at the same time. Sounds horrible. They are already bad alone.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunately there's a lot of people. Let's see. Mental health and health risks are not evenly distributed. There's a lot of people who have a lot of problems, and then a lot of people who are relatively problem free. It's not just like everybody has an equal amount. It is kind of sad.
Yeah, I mean that's where to me points towards that like common causal pathway idea, right? That like it's not like well, I mean maybe there are specific parts of the brain where like this, if this specific spot goes wrong you have Alzheimer's, or this specific spot goes wrong you have schizophrenia. But what it seems like, because like usually you have a bunch of them and not or you're more, I don't know what the way to phrase it so that's accurate. That they cluster together probabilistically implies that like there's some earlier thing in the causal chain, right, that goes wrong, and then that causes everything downstream of it to go wrong.
Yeah, and unfortunately the answer is both processes happen, and more complexly, both processes seem to happen in the same group of people. So, for example, let's say you have something that's highly genetic, like bipolar disorder. We know that that's highly genetic. There's a genetic basis to it. We know that from twin studies and things like that. But we also know that neuroinflammation and stress and things like that also contribute to it. But if your family had someone in it who had bipolar disorder, probably they also had a lot of stress and some of these other biological markers. They may have had diabetes that they couldn't manage with their illness. And so these general and specific risk factors tend to cluster in families, and it creates additive risk that makes it even less equitable. Fascinating.
Regular John adds, how about borderline personality disorder? Why is it called borderline? Differ from regular personality disorder and others like dissociative identity disorder, or are they all related? Because I also heard the term multiple personality disorder. I assume it has many names, just wondering if they are all related.
That's a great question. So all of the personality disorders have an adjective in front of them. So there's no just regular personality disorder. There's borderline, there's 10 personality disorders. The ones you've probably heard of are borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, maybe obsessive compulsive personality disorder are ones people have heard of. The reason that the adjective borderline is put in front of borderline personality disorder is it was one of the first ones talked about in the field of psychology, at which time psychoanalysis, the Freudian stuff, was very big. And the psychoanalysts conceptualized the borderline between healthy and neurotic as being this kind of gray area, and felt that people who had a borderline personality organization were in that borderline. And so that's where the word comes from, and it has just stuck around. It doesn't have any current meaning other than that's just what the term has been called, and it hasn't been turned into an insult yet, so we're keeping it.
I guess it's in that sense it's similar to like when you name a disease after the person who discovered it, right?
A person,
like,
yeah,
like that
exactly.
name doesn't mean anything beside the historical context in which it was discovered.
Right. Exactly. Great example. And people with borderline personality disorder do dissociate. They have these moments where they feel like they're not real, or the world isn't real, or they aren't sure who they are. They have these like little moments of dissociation. When you have a lot of that dissociation and don't have the other symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and your dissociation becomes really complicated to the point where you might even have multiple senses of your identity, multiple personalities, if you will. We call that dissociative identity disorder. And as you hit on regular John, it used to be called multiple personality disorder. That became an insult. Now we call it dissociative identity disorder.
That's an insult, man.
So, yeah. But what was happening is that people were confusing multiple personality disorder with schizophrenia, for one, and they thought that the person had to have multiple personalities in order to have dissociative identity disorder. And we found that that's not necessarily true of people with dissociative identity disorder. They don't necessarily, those things you've seen on TV of like the 3 Faces of Eve or something, a more recent one, Me, Myself, and I with Jim Carrey or something like that. That's not really how dissociative identity disorder commonly presents. So that's another reason behind the name change.
Regular John says, what is dissociative identity disorder then?
It's when a person dissociates so much that they may not remember actions they took or things that they learned or something like that when they were in an altered state. So, for example, they may cordon off the angry part of themselves, and when they're angry, they may not, when they're no longer angry, they may not remember what they did or felt or saw or kind of anything that happened when they were in that angry state. So it may not necessarily be like, there might not be a personality. You might not like have Stanley, the 45-year-old longshoreman, but you might sort of dissociate off, split off that angry part of yourself. And then when you're back to your normal self, or one of your other states of being, you may not remember or have access to what happened to you when you were in that angry state.